Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So, Fresh Red Kills are the videos where I talk about the books that I have recently finished reading. Today I'm going to be talking about two biographies that I read in November, in part for Nonfiction November. Two biographies that I had on my shelf for a long time, and finally wanted to get around to reading them. I guess I'll talk about this one first. A biography which I don't really think needs any introduction. Most people, I think, have read this. I'm pretty late to the party. But we have I Am Malala, the girl who stood up for education and was shot by the Taliban, by Malala Yousafzai, with Christina Lamb. Now, I had known the basics of this story, but only the basics, really. I knew that Malala was a girl in Pakistan who was on a bus riding to school, and the Taliban came in and shot her in the head for wanting to get an education. And of course, I knew the aftermath of her becoming an activist. But I didn't know a lot about the context. I didn't know a lot about the other things that were going on up to that point. And I have to say, I did really enjoy this. It filled in a lot of gaps. We get actually a pretty good, I think, explanation of what was going on in Pakistan throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s to give us a lot more context for what the Taliban were doing, how they were kind of coming over the border from Afghanistan, the sorts of things that locals were doing, which ones were resisting, which ones were sort of appeasing, how she saw these kind of, or her and her family saw these kind of political and religious shifts going on within the country. And, you know, I think that it's difficult to not be impressed by Malala and, you know, her kind of strength, her conviction. I didn't realize just how much of a spokesperson she was and an activist for education before she was shot. I knew that, you know, the Taliban probably targeted her for a reason, but I didn't realize how many, let's say, like interviews she was doing with international reporters and, you know, the extent really of their activism. And I didn't know anything about, especially her father. He's on the back cover here. I was impressed by him. You know, as a father myself with a daughter, I really ended up finding a lot of admiration for him. And especially, you know, the kind of society that that both of them grew up in, and just how at one point she calls him a liberal progressive. Just how forward-thinking he was when it came to women, when it came to his daughter and education, just how much he was defying the Taliban and the sort of violent religious extremists in his country. You know, obviously it was a dangerous thing to do, and there were serious risks and real risks, and you know, Malala almost lost her life. But it wasn't, of course, just him being an activist. I mean, she was very open with the with media and giving interviews, and she even had like an online diary that she would write anonymously. But I think most people seem to know that it was her. So yeah, it was really interesting. If you want to know not just about Malala's story, but a lot about what was going on in Pakistan, like I said, in the late 90s, early 2000s, to get more context into the state of that country, the way that it is today, I think this is a pretty good window into that world. And this was overall very well written. I liked the writing quite a bit. Now I know, you know, I don't know how much of it is Malala, how much of it is Christina Lamb, but it was well done. Very good. And the other thing I read, and both of these also kind of fall into the Q4 Historathon. That's an event that I created that I've got a bunch of great co-hosts going along with me, where we read nonfiction history, and we divide the year up into 4 quarters, each quarter looking at a different time period. Q4 that we're in right now looks at the years 1820 up to the present. And even though these are biographies, really nonfiction biographies, you know, in a lot of ways they are sort of nonfiction history. So you can learn a little about Pakistani history here, and here you can actually learn a good amount about the history of geek culture. So even though most people are probably familiar with Malala and have read that book probably already, I don't think nearly as many are familiar with this individual or have read this book. So this is Empire of Imagination, Gary Gygax and the Birth of Dungeons & Dragons by Michael Witwer. So this is, it's a biography. Gary Gygax was one of the co-creators of Dungeons & Dragons, a pioneer in role-playing, And he was really the primary. I mean, he didn't have the initial spark to create the role-playing game, but he's the one that developed it really into a playable game, and took TSR, the company that he founded, really to pretty incredible levels, and just created this whole new genre of gaming, of using your imagination and, letting the dice decide certain aspects. But this whole idea of group collective storytelling, I think, is just absolutely fascinating. So, I definitely played some Dungeons and Dragons in high school. I played some in college, and as an adult, I've played it kind of on and off here and there. Never too consistently, but I've always had very fond memories when it comes to role-playing games. And like I said, I'm kind of fascinated by the whole act of collective storytelling. So I thought this would be fun. I wanted to know more about how Dungeons and Dragons came to be, and a little more about Gary Gygax, who, I kind of remember when I was younger, seeing him, maybe on the internet or in videos here and there. But he died back in 2008, and I wanted to know more about the world and how this whole thing came about. So this is written in a sort of very interesting way. I think it was actually the author's, I think it was part of his master's thesis. That's where this originated from. So this is nonfiction, but with a twist. There's fictionalized aspects to this. So that's kind of, he's got a map back here of Lake Geneva, where Gary Gygax was from. It looks like a D&D map. He does have sources. We've got notes to pages to each section. He's got references and selected bibliography, which is not short. There's a decent amount there. He's got different appendixes with Gary Gygax's life work. He's got another appendix about his timeline. So this is fact-based. It is essentially nonfiction. However, the way that Witwer has written it, he's written it in more of a narrative style. So there are passages, when Gary's a child, it's like, young Gary raced down the street with his bike. Or later on, we can have passages like, Gary went into the bathroom and slammed the door and splashed cold water on his face and rested his hands on the sink and looked at himself in the mirror. Those kinds of things that, maybe it happened that way. It's possible, but we don't exactly know. But Witwer has written this in a much more narrative form, based on real stuff, based on stuff that we know really happened. And it's probably pretty true to the way things happen. But still, he is taking some artistic license with this. So if you were interested in this subject, I think that you would have to be comfortable with that sort of approach. And which I didn't mind it, because especially of the subject that we're talking about. So the fact that Gary Gygax did create new avenues really for storytelling, right? He created a whole gaming genre that was wrapped around storytelling and collective storytelling and creativity. So to give his story that sort of narrative treatment did seem really appropriate. And they have some fun with this. Like, instead of chapters, we've got like plus 28, like D&D modifiers. At the beginning of each section, we have, like, when he's a kid, it's level 1. And then there's this little vignette about a dungeon master and a player. Every time we get to a new level, that story kind of continues. And that's a fun little window into maybe the way D&D works, for just in case somebody was reading this and they didn't really know. Although I was confused a little bit about some of those points. I know it says that Michael Witwer is a gamer, but there are certain times where the dungeon master, who is sort of like I think they originally called him a referee, he is sort of like the conductor for the players. There's times when in the descriptions he's rolling for the player. He's like rolling to see if a player hits something or if the player deals damage, which the player should really be rolling that. So I wasn't entirely understanding some of those choices in those sections, but whatever, I just kind of rolled with it. And yeah, Gary Gygax, he's a fairly average person, but it is an interesting story, hearing how basically the game developed, the way that the company TSR, how it kind of blew up and the different directions that Dungeons and Dragons went into, how Gary ends up basically losing everything that he built up through, looks like a good deal of like backstabbing, and then tried to find new avenues of creativity and fulfillment with things like fiction writing. But especially, it does pay a lot of homage to him at the end, where all the different things that Dungeons and Dragons, and therefore Gary Gygax, helped to create, everything from modern gaming to the different creatives and celebrities today that credit their time playing Dungeons and Dragons with, getting them to where they are today. So yeah, this was a nice little window into the world of the creation of Dungeons and Dragons and Gary Gygax. So yeah. These are just my thoughts. If you're new to my channel, I should have said this earlier, I don't call what I do formal reviews. These are just me getting out my thoughts and my ideas about different things that I've read. And I liked both of these. So yeah, we've got I Am Malala by Malala Yousafzai with Christina Lamb, and we've got Empire of Imagination, Gary Gygax and the Birth of Dungeons and Dragons by Michael Witwer. If you've read either of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. And as always, thank you, BookTube.